Here's a constitutional red light warning. Danger ahead for anyone who values freedom. The Second Amendment has always stood as a barrier against the steady push of government power. The idea is simple but powerful. A free people should not only be armed but also disciplined. Words attributed to George Washington that echo through history. That principle feels more under siege today than ever before, especially when officials rush to turn tragedy into an excuse for sweeping new restrictions. On September 2nd, the community in Minneapolis was shaken to its core when gunfire erupted inside Annunciation Church. The scene was horrific, with 2 children killed and 21 others wounded, most of them young. Investigators later revealed the shooter fired more than 100 rounds in the span of minutes, creating chaos and trauma that will not be forgotten. Reports identified the gunman as Robin Westman, a man with prior ties to the church whose life had taken a dark path. The brutality of the event left families grieving, neighbors searching for answers, and leaders under pressure to respond. In the immediate aftermath, Governor Tim Walz stood before the public and declared that Minnesota could not afford to let the moment pass. He announced his intention to call lawmakers into a special session to consider a ban on so-called assault weapons. His words were sharp: if Minnesota lets this slide, then shame on us. He went further, signaling that he expected some Republicans to break with party lines and support new restrictions. That call was framed as urgent and necessary, as though the only path forward was to outlaw certain firearms that millions of Americans legally own. The framing of the debate always leans on the phrase, assault weapons. But what does that actually mean? In practice, it usually targets semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15, which operate the same way as many handguns and shotguns. They fire 1 round per trigger pull, nothing more. According to estimates, there are well over 20 million AR-15 style rifles in circulation among law-abiding citizens across the United States. They are among the most commonly owned firearms in America. The Supreme Court in 2008, in the landmark Heller decision, emphasized that the Second Amendment extends to weapons in common use for lawful purposes. That principle directly covers firearms like the AR-15. Any outright ban collides with that constitutional protection head-on. In moments like this, it is tempting for politicians to ride the wave of emotion. Yet history warns us that liberty is often eroded not in sudden blows, but in gradual steps. James Madison once observed that freedom is more often abridged by slow encroachments than by violent usurpations. His warning is not just a relic of the 18th century. It resonates today when proposals surface that would chip away at rights under the guise of safety. A ban might sound decisive, but its real effect would be to criminalize ownership by people who have done nothing wrong while leaving those with criminal intent unaffected. The tragedy in Minneapolis also became a stage for advocacy groups demanding immediate change. National organizations quickly amplified the call for a ban, presenting it as a moral imperative. The emotional weight of children's lives lost makes their case powerful on the surface. But beneath that surface lies the same tension that has always defined this debate: liberty versus control. The Constitution does not bend in the face of heartbreak. It was written precisely to prevent fleeting passions from dismantling enduring rights. As the debate unfolds, it is worth remembering that the duty of any governor includes upholding the Constitution. When taking office, an oath is sworn to support both the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Minnesota. The question becomes unavoidable. How does pushing for measures that directly contradict the plain text of the Second Amendment square with that oath? This is not a matter of partisan preference, but of fundamental obligation. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Those words are not suggestions, they are law. Every tragedy invites a response, but not every response is wise. History offers guidance through the voices of the Founding Fathers. Washington's reminder of discipline, Madison's warning against encroachments, all point toward a consistent truth. Liberty is fragile, and once surrendered, it is rarely reclaimed. As the special session looms in Minnesota, The nation watches to see whether lawmakers will anchor themselves in constitutional fidelity or drift with the tide of emotion. The governor's push for a special session has been described as a bold response to the crisis, a way to protect Minnesotans. In reality, the proposals extend far beyond a single ban. They include restrictions on high-capacity magazines, expanded background checks, and new funding for community safety programs. Supporters call these common-sense reforms, but each carries constitutional and practical flaws. Magazine bans, for instance, target standard equipment owned by millions of Americans. Expanded background checks are unlikely to deter criminals who rarely obtain weapons through legal channels. The complexity of violent crime cannot be reduced to slogans or paperwork. Advocacy groups quickly stepped forward to demand sweeping action. Moms Demand Action declared that weapons of war end children's lives. Students Demand Action insisted no student should enter a classroom fearing a bullet. Protect Minnesota described the shooting as a breaking point and called for immediate bans. Their language is powerful and emotional, crafted to stir outrage. Yet it rests on the flawed assumption that new laws will restrain the lawless. Criminals, by definition, operate outside regulation. More restrictions fall on those who already comply, while those intent on violence remain unaffected. This cycle plays out across the nation after every mass shooting. Advocacy groups emphasize urgency, describing each incident as a crisis that demands action. The tactic is calculated: build enough pressure that debate over constitutional limits feels like obstruction. Such appeals work in headlines and sound bites, but constitutional rights are not supposed to bend with each emotional storm. They exist as anchors, designed to remain steady when passions flare. The framers understood this danger, which is why they embedded protections that outlast the mood of the moment. Legal precedent reinforces that point. In 2008, the Supreme Court in District of Columbia v. Heller confirmed that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms, especially for self-defense at home. That decision struck down arguments that the right applied only to collective militias. 2 years later, in McDonald v. Chicago, the court extended that protection to the states through the 14th Amendment. These rulings together make clear that neither federal nor state governments can impose blanket bans on firearms commonly owned for lawful purposes. A Minnesota assault weapon or magazine ban would collide directly with those precedents. The takeaway is straightforward: rights rooted in history and tradition cannot be erased by political pressure. When officials pursue laws that contradict the Supreme Court's own rulings, they are not only debating policy, but undermining constitutional fidelity. That is why Minnesota's debate matters nationally. Other states are watching closely, ready to see how far restrictions can stretch before courts intervene. The words of the Founding Fathers still cut through the noise. Thomas Jefferson remarked that laws forbidding the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. His point is as clear today as it was centuries ago. Disarming the law-abiding does not touch those who disregard the law. Instead, it creates vulnerability, leaving good people defenseless while criminals exploit weakness. Public safety cannot be built on that illusion. This tension between emotional appeals and constitutional grounding defines the moment. On one side, the images of grieving families and frightened students demand action. On the other side, the Constitution stands firm, a reminder that liberty must not be surrendered to fear. The challenge is to choose wisely, to hold steady in the storm, and to respect the framework that has protected freedom for generations. Swift action is tempting, but swiftness is not wisdom, and laws born of panic often become regrets etched into history. Republican voices within Minnesota have emphasized that the real issue is not the absence of gun laws, but the failure to enforce the ones already on the books. Representative Jim Nash captured that perspective when he said the state does not need more gun control, it needs criminal control. His reasoning is straightforward: background checks, and new bans will not stop an individual already intent on committing violence. That argument aligns with broader data showing that most offenders acquire firearms illegally or circumvent existing safeguards. Criminal determination often overrides legal barriers, while law-abiding citizens remain the ones affected by restrictions. Supporters of the right to keep and bear arms stress that the focus should be on addressing root causes rather than limiting constitutional rights. Mental health is a recurring concern, with numerous studies pointing to untreated disorders as a factor in many acts of mass violence. Yet access to adequate treatment remains inconsistent, particularly in schools and communities where warning signs may appear early. Expanding resources for counseling, crisis intervention, and early detection could make a measurable difference. Addressing mental health does not infringe on liberty. It strengthens safety without undermining rights. Another area often overlooked in political debate is physical security. Schools, churches, and community centers frequently lack the protective measures that could slow or deter an attack. Programs that place trained resource officers in schools have shown results in deterring violence and responding more quickly when incidents occur. Enhanced building security, from controlled entry points to modern surveillance, can also reduce vulnerabilities. These measures may not eliminate every risk, but they directly address potential targets without shifting blame onto millions of responsible citizens. Law enforcement itself requires support and accountability. Prosecutors too often decline to pursue gun charges fully, leading to repeat offenders returning to the streets. Stronger enforcement of existing laws, paired with meaningful penalties for illegal possession or trafficking, targets those most likely to commit crimes. Increasing penalties for violent offenders, ensuring that those who use firearms in crimes face real consequences, changes the calculus for those who would otherwise act with impunity. These strategies focus the weight of the law on the guilty rather than the innocent. The larger principle is that public policy should aim to punish wrongdoers, not disarm the law-abiding. Thomas Jefferson made that point centuries ago, and his warning remains timely. Benjamin Franklin added his own caution, reminding future generations that those willing to give up essential liberty for temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. His words highlight the danger of surrendering freedoms under pressure. Trading a permanent right for a fleeting sense of security is a bargain that history shows never ends well. Once liberty is ceded, it is rarely restored. Critics argue that resisting new gun laws shows indifference to tragedy. The reality is far different. A commitment to the Constitution does not mean ignoring grief. It means refusing to compound grief with reckless policy. Responsible solutions exist that do not violate rights. Enforcing current laws, expanding mental health support, and upgrading security measures respect both liberty and life. These options demand work and investment, but they preserve the balance of freedom and safety that defines the American system. Quick fixes rooted in bans provide the illusion of action while doing little to protect communities. As Minnesota approaches its special session, the stakes are clear. Lawmakers face a choice between adhering to constitutional obligations or yielding to emotional demands. The decision will reverberate beyond state lines, signaling to the rest of the nation whether rights can be bargained away in moments of fear. The eyes of millions are on this debate, and its outcome will shape the trajectory of the Second Amendment for years to come. For those watching from within Minnesota or across the country, engagement matters. Citizens should contact legislators, remind them of their oath, and urge them to pursue solutions that respect both rights and safety. Sharing accurate information, voicing concerns respectfully but firmly, and staying vigilant ensures that the debate is not dominated by panic. The responsibility to defend liberty does not rest only in courtrooms or capitals. It rests in the hands of every citizen willing to speak up. Freedom endures only when people insist that it be preserved. The challenge is real, but so is the opportunity to stand firm in defense of the Constitution.